Hi, this is Mr. Godfrey, and this first part of your summer assignment, we want to have you practice working with fractions. Now, fractions are a very important type of expression that it's important that we know how to work with those fractions. When we start dealing with more complex fractions, when we start dealing with fractions or expressions that are all variables and those types of things, it's very important that we know how to work with these fractions and we know how to work with them well, not just kind of somehow vaguely remember how to work with fractions, but that we really understand how to work with those. It's going to make our life easier in the long run. Now, I believe there's 2 or 3 reasons why students in general struggle with fractions. One of the reasons I think we struggle with fractions is because we're afraid of them. And basically, we're afraid of them because we don't use them. Once you learn how to use them, then they become a friend to you and you're no longer afraid of them. I liken it to, if you remember when you were younger, jumping into a pool. If your parents have videos of you when you're very small, just learning how to jump in the water or how to swim, you'll notice that you're very afraid, generally speaking, most kids are afraid of just jumping into the water, and they stand on the edge, and until they get the parent to help them jump in, they're really afraid. But once they do it, then the next time they're doing it quicker and more without reservation, and the fear starts to go away because you understand what's going to happen, and so once you understand what's going to happen, the fear goes away. And so fractions are kind of like that. I think we've avoided them so much that we're afraid of them. And so we want to work with them so that they become our friend and we're no longer afraid of these fractions. Another reason I think students struggle with fractions is because somewhere along the line they found a calculator, and in today's technology we can find calculators that will do everything for us, and we really don't even have to think about it. We just enter stuff in. But that leads to our inability to work with fractions because we found a calculator where we can enter in the fractions for us. We can enter in 1/2 plus 1/3 and it spits out the answer simplified and everything for us. And so you don't have to go through the process of finding the least common denominator. You don't have to go through the process of prime factoring. You don't have to go through the process of reducing and all of those things that we do by hand without a calculator. The calculator does it for us, and so we haven't practiced any of those things. The problem is when you get into your upper level mathematics, you have to know how to prime factor. You have to know how to find least common denominators. You have to know how to reduce. You have to know how to do all those things, whether you're working with numbers or with letters. And if you've never practiced those because you had a calculator spitting it out for you all the time, well, now you're going to be in a heap of trouble because you don't have the skills you need to be successful. So we want to make sure that we're not using the calculator as we do these. The third thing I think why students struggle is if they don't have the calculator that deals with fractions for them, they have learned that, well, I can turn those fractions into decimals and then the calculator will do the decimals for me. And again, the problem with that is in mathematics we want exact answers. Fractions are exact answers. Most decimals are estimated answers because the majority of fractions, when you divide them out into a decimal equivalent, they don't come out even, meaning they're decimal numbers, they don't stop. They either go on forever or there's a very long repeating number, but either way, those are estimated numbers. So that method, while it will get you an answer, doesn't give us the exact answer we want in math. So for those reasons, we want to make sure that we understand how to work with fractions. Now, one final comment before we get into what I want to talk about on this video, and that is this. When you're doing your homework, don't use a calculator. Now, there's absolutely no way for me to verify whether you used your calculator on these worksheets or whether you didn't. But, like always, like the Bible says, your sins will find you out. Not that it's a sin to do that, but the idea being that eventually it's going to come out that you use your calculator, because when we give you a quiz or a test where you're not allowed to use the calculator and you haven't practiced it, you're really going to struggle on that quiz or test, and it's going to be quite evident that you didn't do the practicing working without the calculator that you should have. So make sure that you do not use your calculator when you're doing these assignments so that you get the practice using the concept that we want you to get. Okay, in the remainder of this video, what I want to talk about are some properties that we use with fractions and when to use them and when we don't. Because really when it comes down to fractions, as I've observed students in the past, the major issue comes down to the properties that we have apply to some operations but not others. And the student that struggles will apply the property for every operation because they don't know when they should or when they shouldn't use it. So we want to make sure we know what the properties are, but we also want to make sure we know when we should and when we shouldn't do those particular properties that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 of them really quickly in this in the remaining portion of the video. Now, we want to talk about the operations. In math, we have basically 4 operations. We have addition and subtraction, and those are usually grouped together because those are inverse operations of each other. If I want to undo something that I added, then I subtract. If I want to undo something that I subtract, then I add. So they, most of the properties will apply to those 2 together, but not always necessarily. The other 2 operations that we have that you know are multiplication and division. And again, we group these 2 together because they undo each other. If I multiply a number by another number, I can undo that by dividing. And if I've divided something, I can undo it by multiplying. And again, the properties that we use for multiplication and division usually apply to both, but not necessarily. Okay, so having grouped those together, let's look at the first thing that we have to do when we're working with fractions. And that is, when we're adding and subtracting fractions, we must have the same denominator. Okay, we cannot add fractions that do not have the same denominator. So what we have to do is what you probably heard before, is we have to find a common denominator. And the common denominator is usually found by determining what the least common multiple is of all the denominators of all of the fractions that you're adding together. Okay, so in order to do that, you need to know how to prime factor, you need to know what multiple means, and you need to know those things. So again, if you don't practice those without a calculator, you'll never practice how to find the least common multiple, least common denominator, prime factoring, all of that stuff, all of which you're going to have to do later on with just letters. And so we've got to understand it now. Now, that applies to addition and subtraction only. When we're looking at multiplication and division, then we do not need the same denominator. So the same denominator is not, come on, my pen doesn't like those, not needed. Okay? Not netted? No, not needed. Sorry about that. So the same denominators are not needed when we're multiplying and dividing. So again, that's one of those properties that students get mixed up. When do I need a common denominator? When don't I need a common denominator? So when you're adding and subtracting, yes. When you're multiplying and dividing, no. Okay, so there's one thing we got to keep separate. The second thing I want to talk about real quickly is, what do we do once we have the common denominator? Say, when we're adding and subtracting, once we have the common denominator, we only add the numerators. Add numerators only. Man, this pen is really not working well. I'm sorry for that. So once we have the common denominator, then when we add the fractions, we only add the numerator. So our answer is going to have the same denominator as all of the fractions that we're adding together. So we only add the numerators together, but only after we've found the least common denominator, or the least common multiple for the denominators. Now, that's different when you're multiplying and dividing. When you're multiplying and dividing, and actually when you're dividing, it's not even the same. When you're multiplying, you multiply numerator times numerator, so you're going to multiply those two numbers together, and then you're going to multiply denominator times denominator. So when you're multiplying these fractions, you don't have to worry about the common denominator, and you just multiply numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator. Now, when you're dividing, you don't do anything. Okay? Nothing. And I'm trying to say, okay? You don't find common denominators, and you don't multiply, and you don't divide, you don't do anything. Because to divide, there's actually a step in there that you have to remember how to do, where we turn it into a multiplication problem. Hopefully you remember multiply by the reciprocal, but we'll review that. So this property or rule only applies when you're multiplying. So you have those 3 things that you have to remember when you're working with fractions. When you're adding, You only add the numerators once you have a common denominator. When you're multiplying, you just multiply numerators and numerators, denominators and denominators. And when you're dividing, you can't do anything. You don't do anything. You don't find common denominators, and you don't divide numerator and numerator, denominator. You don't do anything. You just leave it alone, okay? Because there's a step involved there. Okay, so those are two properties that I wanted to look at. Now there's one other thing that I do want to discuss when it comes to fractions, and let me erase this real quickly. And it has to do with something that's called, well, you've probably called it canceling. Now I don't like the word cancel because cancel gives the idea that something is being canceled out or being removed. So what I'm going to do is not use that word, and what I'm going to do is what we call pre-reducing. In other words, we're going to reduce fractions before we do the adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing if we can. Now, so you probably have heard of that as canceling, and you'll recognize it here when I talk about it, or when I show you in a moment. But we're going to call it pre-reducing from now on. We're not going to call it canceling, pre-reducing. Okay. Now here's the deal. You cannot pre-reduce when you're adding and subtracting. Okay. You cannot pre-reduce when you're adding and subtracting. Okay. And the way I kind of want you to look at this is you cannot go over a sign or jump over an operation sign to reduce. Okay, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So you cannot go over an operation sign to reduce. So what am I talking about? So if I have 1/2 plus 2/3, most students when they learn about reducing think, oh, that's great, I can reduce or cancel, and I'm only going to use the word so you see what I'm talking about. Cancel by saying, oh, well, there's a 2 in my numerator and a 2 in my denominator, so I can cancel those out. Okay, now you cannot do that because you had to go over this operation sign in order to do it. You cannot go over any operation sign to reduce. So whether it's addition, like I have here, or subtraction, if I had 1/2 minus 2/3, I cannot do this reducing, okay? Because I have to jump over a sign in order to do it. So I can never jump over a sign in order to reduce, all right, when I'm adding or subtracting. Now, again, let me talk about canceling really quickly. The reason I don't like to use the word cancel is most students think, well, if that cancels, that cancel, and basically they cross that off and they just think or imagine or even have been taught that that's not there anymore. So all you're left with is 1/3. Those are canceled. They're not there anymore. Now that's not the case because nothing in math just gets canceled or goes away. What you're actually doing when you're reducing is you're dividing both of these by the same number. Now remember, we can't do this. I'm just showing this to show you what actually happens. So if I were to divide both of these by 2, what I'm actually doing is dividing that by 2. 2 divided by 2 is a 1. I should write a 1 there because that 2 has been reduced to a 1. It hasn't been canceled or removed. It's been reduced to a 1. And then this 2 would be reduced to a 1 as well. So I still have 1s here. Okay, so there's not canceled out. It's not like they're gone away. They've been reduced from a 2 down to a smaller number, in this case a 1. All right, so that's why we call it pre-reducing. Now again, you cannot do it when you're when you're adding or subtracting. Okay, in fact, you cannot pre-reduce when you're dividing either. So we can add division in here as well. Okay, if I have 1/2 divided by 2/3, I cannot reduce across this division sign. So I cannot reduce this 2 with this 2. Because in order to do so, I have to jump over that division sign. So I cannot reduce or pre-reduce with a division sign. So basically, what does that leave us? Pre-reducing, or this nice idea that you've known in the past as canceling, we're not going to use that word anymore, only works for multiplication. Okay, we can pre-reduce only with multiplication. I just lost my lights. I got to turn them on. I'll be right back. So only with multiplication can we pre-reduce. So if I have 1/2 times 2/3, now there's no multiplication sign in between here. We've got two parentheses next to each other which indicates multiplication. So when it's multiplication, well, if you didn't have parentheses, if you had 1/2 times 2/3, which occasionally you will see, you will not see 1/2 times 2/3 in upper level math. So I don't want you to use it because that looks like the variable x, and we use x so often that we don't want to get confused. I also don't like to use the dot because if we're dealing with a number here and another number, it could look like a decimal point, so I don't want to use that. So I use parentheses only to indicate multiplication. So because this is a multiplication problem and I don't have to jump over a plus sign, minus sign, or division sign, then it is okay to reduce this to a 1 and reduce that to a 1, and then we can multiply our fractions. Numerator times numerator, 1 times the 1 that's left here now, and denominator times denominator, 1 times 3 is 3. So this would be my answer. So it's important to know when we need a common denominator and when we don't. It's important to know what we do once we have the common denominator, what we do with the numerators and denominators when we're adding, subtracting, and multiplying, dividing, and when we can and when we cannot pre-reduce our problems. Okay? So that lays the basic properties for fractions. In the following videos, we'll take a look at how we add and subtract fractions, finding the least common multiple of the denominators, and then we'll look at multiplication and division. We'll also look at how do we deal with mixed numbers, and hopefully that will wrap up what we need to know about fractions, and we'll be very good at those starting next year, and we don't have to be afraid of those fractions anymore.